I'm about to serve you what NYU journalism professor Jay Rosen calls a truth sandwich. The truth, followed by the lie, followed by the truth again, this time in video. The truth is the bread. In the middle is a Donald Trump lie. Donald Trump did an idiotic and false caricature of Joe Biden after President Biden's speech on Friday about Donald Trump being a danger to democracy. The Trump lie was, what he actually said was, he's stuttering through the whole thing. We will now show you exactly what President Biden said about Trump and democracy on Friday, followed by, in the truth sandwich style, what Donald Trump lied about what Joe Biden said.
Trump's assault on democracy isn't just part of his past. It's what he's promising for the future. He's willing to sacrifice our democracy, put himself in power.
Did you see him? He was stuttering through the whole thing. He's going, he's a threat to democracy. I'm a threat. They've weaponized government. He's saying, I'm a threat to democracy. He's a threat to democracy. Well, okay. Couldn't read the word. He's a threat to democracy. You know how bad the press is? You know what they do? They take me saying that like that, and they say, Trump couldn't say the word democracy.
Trump's assault on democracy isn't just part of his past. It's what he's promising for the future. He's willing to sacrifice our democracy, put himself in power.
Turns out they can both pronounce democracy. So no, the press will not say that Donald Trump cannot pronounce democracy. But what the press should say is that Donald Trump lied about Joe Biden not being able to pronounce democracy correctly and lied about Joe Biden stuttering during his speech. Little Joe Biden did stutter as a child, and big 77-year-old Donald Trump thinks that's funny. Because if someone Donald Trump doesn't like has a disability, he always thinks that's funny.
I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
We don't know which presidential candidate will receive the most votes from disabled American war veterans, but we know only one of the candidates publicly makes fun of the disability of war veterans who oppose him. Donald Trump still hasn't gotten over the late Senator John McCain's decisive vote in the Senate against Donald Trump's attempt to repeal Obamacare and leave over 20 million people without health insurance. It is customary for senators to raise their hand to cast their votes, signaling a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the Senate floor. They do that to make it very clear to the Senate clerk, who might be some distance away, exactly how they're voting. Everyone in the Senate always knew that because of his Vietnam War wounds suffered when his plane was shot down in Vietnam, and he was tortured for several years as a prisoner of war, that John McCain could not raise his hands above his head when casting his vote. He wasn't the only one. Republican Senator Bob Dole could not move his right arm at all because of the wounds that he suffered in combat in Italy during World War II. Democratic Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii had no right arm because he lost it in combat in World War II. Other current and former senators left parts of their body on battlefields while in combat, something no one in the Trump family has ever endured. The day after Donald Trump lied about Joe Biden stuttering on the word democracy, he told Iowa voters that he would try to repeal Obamacare again if he wins the presidency. Again, he didn't tell them that he will fail once again to repeal Obamacare because Republican senators now live in fear of the political dangers of repealing Obamacare. And while he was on the subject, Donald Trump could not hide his hatred of Republican Senator John McCain, who has been dead for 5.5 years.
Obamacare is a catastrophe. Nobody talks about it. You know, without John McCain, we would have had it done. But John McCain, for some reason, couldn't get his arm up that day. Remember? He goes that like that. That was the end of that.
For some reason, Donald Trump knows the reason John McCain could not raise his arms higher.
This is coming from a president who called, when he visited cemeteries, called dead soldiers suckers and losers. Remember that?
That was more of what Joe Biden had to say about Donald Trump on Friday in the first Biden campaign speech of the year. For some reason, Donald Trump did not mention that part of Joe Biden's speech when he was lying about the Biden speech. We will surely be hearing the word democracy in every one of Joe Biden's campaign speeches this year. And there's another word that has now appeared in the first two campaign speeches of the year by President Biden.
Let's be clear about the 2020 election. Trump exhausted every legal avenue available to him to overturn the election, every one. But the legal path just took Trump back to the truth, that I'd won the election and he was a loser.
Loser. No word cuts Donald Trump more deeply than the word loser because he has such a perverse comprehension of the words winner and loser. Everyone knows in athletics and in everything else, you win some, you lose some. The greatest athletes of all time won and lost. Hundreds of hugely talented people assembled for a dinner party of sorts at the Beverly Hilton last night for the Golden Globes, and most of them lost. The word loser does not define those artists. Because Donald Trump's lifetime insecurity is so profoundly perverse, he cannot bear the word loser. He unleashed an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6 to pretend that he was not the loser of the presidential election. Joe Biden obviously knows how much Donald Trump fears the word loser, which is why you can expect to continue to hear the word loser in Joe Biden's campaign speeches about Donald Trump. And you can expect Donald Trump to lie about Joe Biden stuttering on the word democracy. But for some reason, Donald Trump has not accused Joe Biden of stuttering when pronouncing Donald Trump a loser.